Okay, let's get started with lecture. So today we're going to cover loops, arrays, and libraries for our programming section. But first, let's go into a couple of announcements. So we have homework 9, which is going to be the last required homework. That's going to be due November 30th, so after Thanksgiving break. Homework 10 will be due the same day, but that's optional and you can do it for extra credit. It'll also be good practice. It's also a very fun homework. Yeah, that was my favorite homework. Lab 9 is going to be due November 28th, and that will be the last lab. And then also about the final project, hopefully if you guys have gotten started on designing it. Check-in will be due this Friday, so tomorrow, by 11:59. Yeah, so come to office hours. If there are no more office hours, you can email your TA, and hopefully we can schedule a time. We have the whole project, including the coding part of it, being due Tuesday, November 28th at 11:59. And we'll have project presentations that day during class. And so this is going to be the last content lecture. And so the next lecture will be just project presentations and some other miscellaneous content. So yeah, now time to get into some programming content. First, we're going to review some of the stuff that we've learned already with event handlers. So yeah, as a very basic introduction into this whole topic, we have the DOM, which is the document object model. Basically, whenever we load an HTML page, this is what gets rendered into our JavaScript. Basically, it's a representation of what that HTML page looks like using these little objects, which is each of the little squares. And each one of these objects has functions, maybe append child, or it has get element by ID or something like that. And then it also has properties, which are like class list, the inner HTML, the style, etc. So for example, one way that you guys might be familiar now with practicing some JavaScript is document.getElement by ID of food list. So this will look through our entire document, which is our entire HTML file, and it'll look to see if we can find food list, which the ID of food list. So yeah, what we're saying is that from our document object model, we find the element with the ID food list, which is the hashtag thing. So yeah, every DOM element has an onClick function, and this onClick function will run anytime we click on that element. So for example, if we have like a p tag that has an onClick, that onClick will run whenever our mouse clicks over that p tag. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. So yeah, this is just a quick little example. We select this button element, document.getElement by ID of like pop-up button, and then we give it this onClick of show greeting. And we create this show greeting function to just alert howdy. So whenever we click on that button, the pop-up button, that will trigger this show greeting to run. Perfect. So we don't have to add classes to modify CSS. So we can assign style.property to a string value. So for example, element.style.background color will assign whatever element we're specifying to have a background color of the color that we pass in. Yeah, we read the text, the CSS reads the text that we give it and uses that value to change the CSS. Does anyone have questions on how that's working? Okay, cool. The important thing to note here is that you can't change like element.background color. You have to change element.style.background color. But yeah. Yeah. So when we're looking at element.style.background color, this is like the style property. And then we can see we passed into this function red. So the background color of this element will become red. Any questions on this? Okay, great. So yeah, here we're using something called anonymous functions to nest our action inside of the event handler. Yeah, it's just a different way of defining a function if it only needs to be used once. Yeah, not super, super important, but just a fun little thing to keep note of. And so next we're gonna move on to arrays. So in JavaScript, an array is a list of values, and we use them to represent multiple objects in one name. So for example, if we have like a grocery cart, we might have three things in there. We have like a protein, we have caffeine, and we have bananas. But this is all inside of one grocery cart. So we maintain a list of all the things inside of our grocery cart. And so, yeah, we declare our variables exactly the same as we have been. We just use the let and then whatever word we want to call it. The only difference is that we declare the array by putting its values inside of these like square brackets. And then we separate each of the items inside by a comma. So we see that protein is our first element here, caffeine is our second element, and bananas is our third element. And then because it's our last item, we don't have to put a comma afterwards. Perfect. So every array has a built-in attribute or property that's called .length. And this is a built-in JavaScript attribute that has that just tells us the length of the array. So in this example, cart.length will give us a value of 3. Does everyone understand that? Any questions? Okay, perfect. So how do we access the information inside of that array? So a lot of programming languages have zero index arrays, which might be difficult to get used to. But the first element of every array starts at index 0. So yeah, we start from the 0th element, if that makes sense. So yeah, in our example, let cart equal apples, oranges, and bananas. We can access the apples by saying cart at 0, using the square brackets again. We can say oranges is cart at 1, and bananas is cart at 2. Any questions on how we index into an array? Okay. So where are arrays useful? Yeah, so up until now, we've been using this get element by ID to get a specific element from our document, one at a time. But we've also used classes in our CSS before. You guys are probably very familiar with classes. But yeah, so we need to be able to cover the case where there are multiple elements that all have the same class. So we use this different function called document.get elements by class name. And this will give us an array, which we just learned is just the way that we combine a whole bunch of elements together. And we'll get an array of elements of all elements that contain food, the class food item. Does this make sense? Okay. So yeah, as as the slide is saying, this word here is plural, meaning that we're getting multiple items in one of these function calls. So here's a little example on the difference between get element by ID and get elements by class name. We have get element by ID of food list, and it'll select only the specific one that has food list. And HTML actually doesn't allow you to write multiple elements with the same ID. So we select this UL ID equals food list. In contrast, we can select all of the food items by using get elements by class name. So then this, when we run that function, what we'll get back is this food variable, or whatever we call it, and it'll have 3 elements, which are the 3 li tags. Any questions on how get elements by class name works? Perfect. So yeah, which of these, so this is another example of Airbnb's website. Does anyone have any ideas on what might be using classes and what might be using IDs? Mm-hmm. All the listings would be classes? Yeah, perfect. Yeah, one example might be that like each of these boxes that represents like one home is specified by a class, but this whole nav bar up here is probably its own ID. Great point. Any other examples? Perfect, no worries. Yeah, so let's go into loopy loops. Basically just how we go through a piece of code multiple times without having to rewrite it. So there's multiple kinds of loops, and this is pretty universal in programming. So if you're planning on taking any other CS classes, this is something that might be useful. We have while loops. We have do while loops. We have for each loops, and we have for loops. So this is a lot more complex than some other programming languages, but most will have this same kind of concept. So the important one for us is for loops. So a for loop allows you to repeat some code until a certain condition is met, or for a certain number of times. So that is kind of confusing, so let's break it down. So what is a for loop? It does something for you a certain number of times without you having to tell it every single iteration. So it's much cleaner and makes it a lot easier to maintain and lets you do things any amount of times that you want. So in this example, we have a for loop with let I equal to 1 with a little semicolon after. And it says I is less than 10 with a little semicolon after that, and I plus plus. So this is very specific syntax, but what this is saying is that we are going to iterate through the code, or we're going to run the code inside of this 10 times over, or sorry, 9 times over, counting from 1. So we have this console.log saying counting to 9, and then adding on whatever the number I is. So yeah, this is like the syntax of a most basic for loop. So let's break it down. We have our start, where we create a variable named I, and this is just convention, but we name it after the word index. And then we set the variable value to 1, which it can start at any number, but in this example, we start at 1. We give it an end condition, which is saying that like we keep doing the actions inside of the for loop as long as I is less than 10. So yeah, it'll perform the action in this for loop right after this check. And then our last part of our for loop statement is the repeat. So this is saying that we increment I by 1. Basically, I just goes up by 1 every time the loop repeats its execution. So yeah, after incrementing I, it'll check it again and then repeat and keep going. So yeah, this I++ is can also be written as I plus equals to 1 or I is equal to I plus 1. But yeah, so basically what this is doing is we're running the left side of the code without making so much of a mess in our files and making it go down from 9 lines of code to 3. And you can imagine if we wanted to do it 100 times, it'd be a lot easier to use it if it's in a for loop. So what will this code print? Does anyone have any ideas? We have a for loop that starts at 0, ends when I is less than 10, and increments up each time. Yeah, so perfect. It'll print every number from 0 to 9. Let's do another example. So what if we added an equal sign? So it's instead of less than 10, we have less than or equal to 10. Any ideas? Okay, so this one is going to be pretty much the same. It's just we're going to add on the 10. So we go from 0 to 9 as we did before, but we also do 10 because it can be equal to 10. So now, one last example of how we add in the arrays. What will this print? If we have a cart that is an array of 3 elements, that is protein, caffeine, and bananas, and we run this for loop on from 0 to as long as it's less than the cart length, and then we print out what the value in the cart is. This one's a little bit more tricky. Okay, no worries. This code will print out the elements in our cart, and I'll break down why. So we start at an I equals to 0, and then that is the first element because we index by 0, and we go all the way up until I is less than the cart length. So the cart length is 3 in this case, and the last value that will actually run this code is 2 because it needs to be less than 3. And because we're 0 indexed, the cart at position 2 will be this third element, which is a little bit confusing. And it's going to take a little bit of practice to fully understand that. But just as like a little piece of syntax, this is a pretty common thing of like iterating through an array. Last, we'll talk pretty briefly about JavaScript libraries. So JavaScript, like HTML and CSS, has a very strict set of like syntax rules that define what we're calling a logical executable environment. So libraries are built on top of that and act as some tools that we can use straight out of the box, just very easy to understand. And we'll give a couple of examples here. So we have particles.js. This is a library that allows you to create little dots on the screen and connect them in different ways. Yeah, it's a fun little like motion thing to add to a page. We have like confetti. in case you wanted to recreate your Berkeley letter of acceptance. So yeah, it just auto does all of the calculations for having confetti fall down a screen. We have Plier, I think. It's a video player or media player. Allows you to play from YouTube, allows you to play from Vimeo, all that kind of stuff. Straight out of the box, and makes it very easy. Snap SVG is a easy way of creating and displaying SVGs, which are types of images. 3.js is a 3D modeling library that allows you to create 3D environments easily on the web. And so here's an example that you guys can look at later on, but this is called the Aviator. We have Matter.js, which is a physics engine, allows you to drop balls and play around with objects. Yeah, and just basically simulates any physics that you want to do without hard math calculations. AOS, which I believe is a type of fade software that like allows you to very easily make crossfades and stuff like that. Jump.js allows you to create very nice looking scroll animations. Typeit allows you to make really cool like typing software. Yeah, so those are just a couple of examples of like libraries that you can use in JavaScript. JavaScript is really amazing because it has so many of these available. So yeah, definitely if you're interested in going into this, exploring libraries is a good way to go. It can very easily make your life a lot easier.